I'm 80 years old. I was born in 1932 in Brooklyn, New York, and then enrolled at the University of Pennsylvania, where I graduated in 1954. And actually, I came out to San Francisco to work in real estate. And I did work in real estate for a brief period. And then I made some pretty astonishing discoveries. I came across a book by Mahatma Gandhi, his autobiography, and that just totally turned me around in terms of who I was and what I thought of the world and about myself, and how I needed to be changed and how the world needed to be changed. And I adopted a lot of Gandhi's beliefs, particularly with regards to nonviolent action. I was also reading Arnold Toynbee and Henry Bergson and Carl Jung and Emerson, as I mentioned, and Henry David Thoreau. All these things had a dramatic impact on the way I viewed myself and the way I viewed the world. And I decided to take the very best ideas that I uncovered in my readings and not just believe in them, but actually apply them in my life. Well, my parents saw these changes in me. They were living in New York City, in Manhattan, and they came out to visit here periodically. And it ended up in 1962 with my parents, after trying very, very determinedly to change my ways, to get me back to the person I had been, who I had already given up on. I realized this was not the person I wanted to be. I admitted to the person I was, which was not a very good person, and decided that I was going to be different. I was going to grow out of that. That was just a stage that I was in, and it was a stage that was no longer suitable for me. And they liked the other person I was, the person I no longer liked. And they thought that because I was charting a different course for myself, that I was suffering from some kind of illness. And they insisted on my seeing a psychiatrist. Well, I had read a little bit about psychology and psychiatry, and I realized that it wasn't for me, because there was no place in the books on psychology that I read that put a deity in the forefront of human existence. And that's what I had done. I had become a theocentric person, a God-centered, God-oriented person. Well, in psychology and psychiatry, to have that point of view is to have a delusion. And I wasn't buying it, so I wouldn't see the psychiatrist. So my parents eventually arranged for my being committed, and that was in October of 1962, right around the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I was locked up for more than 7 months, and during that period, all very legal, I was given 50 insulin coma treatments and 35 electroshock treatments. And this wiped out my memory for the 3-year period, which I had considered to be the most wonderful time of my life in terms of my becoming more aware of who I was. You cannot retain your memories when you're having a portion of your brain carpet bombed with electricity and other chemicals, and expect to be able to have good recall for your previous experience, which was, for me, a period of transformation. I had lost that, so I had to retrace my steps. When I was released from the institution, I was supposed to be normalized at that point. The memory loss covered the complete 3-year period before I was locked up. I didn't even know that John F. Kennedy was the President of the United States when I finally came out of that last coma, although he had been elected 2.5 years earlier. The damage to the brain initially has an effect whereby the person thinks that they have been helped. They are suffering a form of brain damage, and the brain damage makes them feel euphoric for a while. It's very temporary, but it does happen in many cases. In many other cases, it doesn't happen at all. But the euphoria is interpreted by the psychiatrist as a lifting of the depression, which is a major indication for using electroshock on people today. It also reinforces the medical model. It makes them look like real doctors because it's done in a hospital-like setting, and they wear white jackets and whatnot, and they look like doctors, and it seems like a medical procedure when it has nothing to do with medicine at all. It's a human rights issue. This electroshock is imposed on people as a way of punishing them and controlling them for stepping out of line or falling out of line or for being different. It's a way of dealing with nonconformists, eccentrics, and people who just can't make it on their own. Like if they're not holding up their end of the economic bargain, if they're not working, for example, or going to school, then that's regarded by the rest of society as a kind of madness. I mean, why would anyone expect to live in a society without working or going to school? Well, I wasn't going to school, and I wasn't working, and that was the major reason why they locked me up, because I could set a bad example for other people if I were able to survive intact. But by punishing me, I became an example of what could happen to other people who might be inclined to undertake the same journey that I had undertaken starting back in 1959. So there is a necessity for dealing with outliers, outsiders, people who are different, who don't go along with the social program that they have been indoctrinated into. I was not going along with that program, and I was perceived as someone who was in fact a troublemaker, and they didn't want to see me that way. They wanted to see me as a backward individual who had some kind of brain disease that I was suffering from, and their treatments by damaging the brain were going to correct the problem. Well, they didn't correct the problem at all, and there was no problem to begin with. There was just a person who was striking out on his own on a different course, and that's the way society dealt with people then, and still deals with people. And it's a totally subjective thing, this idea of madness and mental illness. There's no scientific basis for it whatever. I was released in May of 1962, and here it is. It's more than 50 years. At any rate, I lived here and have lived here for more than 50 years. And this is where I did my studying, and you see all the books around here. These are the books that I acquired after I was released from the institution, so-called hospital, which was not a hospital at all. It was a place of confinement, like a prison, where they were able to do terrible things to me without any responsibility at all for the effects of what they had done. And this I regard, of course, as a great injustice, not only a great injustice to me, but the countless tens and hundreds of thousands of people who have been locked up in these places. Very few of them, relatively speaking, who we hear from afterwards. It ruins their lives because they're no longer able to be engaged into society. And to a large extent, I was no longer able to be engaged in the society. But it didn't disengage me from my studies. I went right back to them, and I reacquired a lot of that knowledge that I had lost, and went on to acquire new knowledge. So I think of myself now as far more learned than I was at the end of that 3-year period of study in 1962. And I did that for 6 or 7 years, and then I went to work for a friend of mine who had an art gallery in downtown San Francisco. Then I opened up my own art gallery for about 5 years, and it was there that I heard about the psychiatric inmates survivor movement. And having the gallery in a very choice location in downtown San Francisco near transportation and whatnot, it enabled me to use that facility for the meetings that were held by an organization which I co-founded called the Network Against Psychiatric Assault, NAPA. Before that, I had been on the staff of a very small journal called Madness Network News. We were developing our own movement there. It was at the very early stages of our movement. And it's greater perhaps now than ever before, but it's not as well organized. There are some very, very good things that are happening now, especially with the Mad in America site and website, and an organization called Mind Freedom out of Eugene, Oregon. When we began in 1971, 72, we were really breaking new ground, and we had to introduce the public to these very revolutionary ideas. These are not medical problems that are subject to any kind of medical intervention that is going to do any good. It's a wrong way of looking at the problem. The problem is a spiritual problem, an existential problem. It's a way of living and a way of thinking and being that is involved here, and those things are not subject to medical interventions of any kind. And it's legitimized because of the labels that these people are given that suggests or supposedly demonstrates that they're suffering from a mental illness. Medical diagnoses and medical disease are two different things. There are plenty of diagnoses for which there are no diseases at all. And in the case of psychiatry, that is the truth for virtually everything that they diagnose. But there's no test that will validate the existence of a mental illness